There is a moment in the autumn of 1095 that deserves your full attention. Not a battlefield, not a siege. A field in Clermont, France, and a single man standing before a crowd that stretched beyond the horizon of recorded memory. Pope Urban II had climbed a wooden platform on the 27th of November. He had prepared his words with the surgical precision of a man who understood that language, deployed correctly, was itself a weapon of mass mobilization. What he was about to do was not merely deliver a speech. He was engineering the largest voluntary military mobilization the medieval world had ever attempted. The crowd that gathered at Clermont was not an army. It was a civilization waiting to be aimed. To understand why Urban's words detonated with such force, you must first understand the geopolitical canvas upon which he was painting. The year 1095 was not a moment of Christian triumphalism. It was, in fact, a moment of profound anxiety. The Byzantine Empire, that last great eastern bulwark of Roman civilization, the Christian shield between the Islamic world and the European heartland, was fracturing. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had watched the Seljuk Turks dismantle his army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 with a cold, professional efficiency that left Anatolia effectively lost. 24 years later, Alexios was a desperate man. He sent envoys to Urban not as a peer requesting cooperation, but as a general requesting reinforcements. He needed mercenaries. He needed soldiers. What he got was a crusade. Urban's genius, and it was a form of strategic genius, was to take Alexios' military request and reframe it as something transcendent. He did not speak of Byzantine borders. He spoke of Jerusalem. The Holy City had been under Islamic rule since 638, for over 4 centuries. For most of those centuries, Christian pilgrims had been permitted access. Commerce, tolerance, and pragmatic coexistence had governed the relationship between Christian pilgrims and the various Islamic administrations that controlled the city. But the Seljuk Turks, newly dominant and less accommodating than the Fatimid Caliphate they were displacing, had disrupted the flow of pilgrims. Reports, many exaggerated, some fabricated, began arriving in Europe of atrocities against Christian holy sites and pilgrims. Urban weaponized those reports. His speech at Clermont was a masterpiece of strategic communication. He spoke of Christian brothers suffering in the East. He invoked the sacred geography of Jerusalem, a city that occupied the literal and theological center of the medieval Christian worldview. He offered something unprecedented in church doctrine, a plenary indulgence, the complete remission of sins for all who took up the cross. The crowd's response was immediate and visceral. Deus leviut, they roared. God wills it. That phrase became the battle cry of the First Crusade. But beneath its religious simplicity lay a structure of extraordinary complexity. The grand strategy of the First Crusade was, on paper, nearly incoherent. There was no unified command. There was no common treasury. There were no standardized supply lines, no single logistical authority, and no coherent diplomatic framework governing relations with the Byzantine Empire, whose territory the crusading forces would have to traverse. What Urban had created was not an army. He had created a movement, and movements are notoriously difficult to control. The principal military contingents that would eventually coalesce into the First Crusade's fighting force were divided along feudal lines, each answering to its own lord. Godfrey of Bouillon led the Lorraine contingent. Raymond IV of Toulouse commanded the largest and best-equipped southern French force. Bohemond of Taranto, perhaps the most militarily sophisticated of all the crusading commanders, led the Norman contingent from southern Italy. Hugh of Vermandois, Robert of Normandy, and Robert II of Flanders brought their own substantial retinues. These were not subordinates. They were peers, bound together by a shared religious purpose and separated by competing ambitions, personal rivalries, and fundamentally different visions of what the crusade was ultimately for. The logistics of moving these forces from Western Europe to Jerusalem represented what we might today call a masterpiece of logistical friction, a triumph, not of smooth execution, but of a system grinding forward despite every obstacle. Before the armored knights of the feudal nobility had even finished assembling, the crusade produced its first catastrophe. The People's Crusade of 1096, led by the charismatic preacher, Peter the Hermit and the militarily reckless Walter Sansevore was the uncontrolled eruption of popular religious fervor that Urban's speech had inadvertently unleashed. Tens of thousands of peasants, minor clerics, and impoverished soldiers marched east with no coherent logistics, no professional military leadership, and no realistic understanding of the distance or difficulty that awaited them. They massacred Jewish communities in the Rhineland en route, one of the Crusade's earliest and most shameful chapters, revealing the violence that lay beneath the surface of the movement's sanctified exterior. They plundered Byzantine territory because they had no supply system. When they finally crossed into Anatolia, the Seljuk Turks did not even need to deploy a sophisticated response. They simply annihilated the column at Civilisations in October 1096. The People's Crusade was not a military force. It was a humanitarian catastrophe dressed in crusading rhetoric. Its destruction served, paradoxically, as a sobering lesson for the professional nobility who followed. When the genuine military contingents of the First Crusade began assembling at Constantinople in late 1096 and early 1097, there was at least a functional awareness that this undertaking would require more than faith. Emperor Alexios received these armed pilgrims with the wary calculation of a chess player who has obtained a powerful but unpredictable piece. He needed them. He feared them. He moved quickly to extract oaths of homage from each of the crusading leaders, binding them, in theory, to return any recovered Byzantine territory to imperial control. These oaths were sworn, and they were almost immediately contested. Bohemond of Taranto, watching the Byzantine court with the cold assessment of a professional who recognized opportunity, had already begun calculating how these commitments could be renegotiated once the military situation shifted in his favor. The relationship between the Crusaders and Byzantium was thus established on a foundation of mutual necessity and mutual suspicion that would define and ultimately doom their collaboration for the next century. The geopolitical canvas of 1095 to 1099 was further complicated by the fragmentation of the Islamic world. This is a fact of foundational importance that is too frequently omitted from popular accounts of the First Crusade. The Islamic Near East in 1095 was not a monolithic bloc awaiting the crusading onslaught with unified resistance. It was a political landscape of extraordinary fragmentation. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad retained nominal religious authority but had lost all real political power to the Seljuk Turks. The Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo controlled Egypt and intermittently controlled Jerusalem itself, locked in a sectarian conflict with the Sunni Seljuks that was as bitter as any they maintained with Christian powers. Local Seljuk governors, the Atabegs, functioned as quasi-independent rulers, more concerned with their rivalries with each other than with the distant threat materializing to the west. When the crusading army descended upon the Near East, it was not striking a fortress, it was striking a mosaic. The fragmentation was, arguably, the single most decisive force multiplier the Crusaders possessed. The Islamic world's inability to present a unified defensive response in 1097-1099 was not a failure of courage or capability. It was a structural consequence of political fragmentation that Urban II, in his planning at Clermont, could not possibly have fully understood, but which his armies would exploit to devastating effect. The stakes of the enterprise were, in every dimension, impossible. The crusading force that eventually marched from Constantinople toward Jerusalem numbered perhaps 50,000 to 60,000 people in total, of whom perhaps 7,000 to 10,000 were trained cavalry, the armored strike force of medieval warfare. They were marching into an environment of extreme climatic hostility through terrain they did not know, against enemies whose language they did not speak, toward a city whose fortifications they had no certainty of breaching. Their supply chain was essentially non-existent beyond what they could carry, requisition, or plunder. Their medical understanding of the diseases that would devastate their ranks was nil. Their maps were theological constructs, diagrams of sacred geography that told them where God lived but not how to find water in the Syrian desert. And yet they moved forward. The question that makes the First Crusade one of the most analytically fascinating military enterprises in the record of human conflict is not why they failed. Against every rational probability assessment, they did not fail. The question is why they succeeded. That answer begins on the plains of Anatolia, in the shadow of a city called Nicaea, where the Crusaders' first genuine military test would reveal both the extraordinary competence and the extraordinary dysfunction that would characterize the entire enterprise. The design of conflict at Clermont in 1095 was a work of political architecture built on theological foundations, sustained by logistical improvisation and aimed at an objective of world historical ambition. It was also, beneath all of its sacred language and its genuine religious conviction, a profoundly human enterprise, driven by ambition, shaped by fear, powered by the remarkable and terrifying capacity of human beings to organize collective violence in the name of the transcendent. The crusading era had begun, and the canvas was bloodied before the first true battle had even been fought. To understand what happened on the roads between Constantinople and Jerusalem, you must first understand the instruments. The First Crusade was, at its core, a problem of combined arms, a term we associate with modern warfare but which describes a challenge as old as organized combat itself. How do you integrate different categories of military capability into a coherent, mutually reinforcing system? The Crusaders' answer to that question was partial, improvised, and frequently chaotic, but it was, ultimately, sufficient. Let us examine the components. The armored knight, the Miles, was the apex predator of 11th century European warfare. His effectiveness rested on three interlocking elements: the destrier, the lance, and the charge. The destrier was not simply a large horse. It was a specialized war machine, bred for aggression, trained to function amid the noise and chaos of combat, capable of carrying a fully armored man at a controlled canter across broken terrain. A quality destrier represented a capital investment comparable to several years' agricultural income for a prosperous peasant family. These animals were transported to the Near East at enormous logistical cost, and their attrition to disease, heat exhaustion, and inadequate forage would become one of the Crusade's most persistent and damaging supply problems. The lance, couched under the arm and driven by the momentum of the horse, was the primary kinetic instrument of the cavalry charge. When executed correctly against infantry or lightly armored cavalry, the armored lance charge was a force multiplier of exceptional violence. A disciplined line of perhaps 1,000 knights in full charge generated kinetic energy sufficient to shatter almost any infantry formation that failed to present an unbroken wall of pikes or spear points. The critical word is disciplined. The armored charge required precise timing, cohesion, and, most critically, the restraint to not charge prematurely. The knights of 11th century Europe were, by cultural formation, acutely resistant to restraint. They were bred to individual combat glory, trained in a tradition that celebrated the aggressive, the bold, and the personally decisive. Holding a line of armored cavalry steady while enemy arrows fell among them, waiting for the precise moment of maximum tactical advantage, required a quality of command authority that the Crusade's collegial, multi-headed leadership structure struggled repeatedly to provide. The infantry contingent of the crusading force was the element most frequently underanalyzed in popular accounts. The spearmen, crossbowmen, and foot soldiers who formed the bulk of the crusading column were not merely a logistical tale for the knights. They were a defensive system without which the cavalry could not function. The crossbow, the ballista manualis of medieval military science, was the infantry's primary answer to the mounted archer. With a draw weight that could exceed 500 pounds on the most powerful designs, a crossbow bolt was capable of penetrating the mail armor standard among Seljuk cavalry at ranges of up to 150 meters. Its rate of fire was slow, perhaps 2 bolts per minute for a trained crossbowman with a windlass mechanism, but its penetrative capability made it a decisive defensive weapon when deployed in disciplined ranks. The tactical function of the crusading infantry was to provide what we might recognize as a protective envelope around the cavalry. By marching in tight, disciplined formations with interlocked shields and presenting a continuous front of spear and crossbow, the infantry could absorb and suppress the Turkish horse archer attacks that were the Seljuk army's primary tactical instrument. The cavalry, sheltered within this envelope, could be preserved intact for the decisive moment of shock action. This integrated doctrine infantry as defensive screen, cavalry as offensive hammer, was not written in any manual. It emerged from brutal operational experience on the Anatolian plateau, refined under fire as the crusading commanders learned to read the tactical language of an enemy entirely unlike anything they had encountered in European warfare. The Seljuk military system represented a fundamentally different philosophy of war, where the European military tradition prized shock, the decisive, concentrated, close-range application of violent force. The Seljuk tradition prized mobility, harassment, and attrition. The Seljuk cavalry archer, the Sipahi, was a professional soldier of extraordinary skill. Mounted on a fast, light-step horse, he could operate at ranges that kept him entirely beyond the reach of European lance or sword. His composite bow, a laminated construction of wood, horn, and sinew that stored dramatically more energy than its modest size suggested, was capable of delivering a killing shot at 100 to 200 meters. More critically, the Sipahi could execute this fire from a moving horse, in any direction, including backward, the famous Parthian shot that had terrified Roman legions a millennium earlier. The Seljuk tactical doctrine against heavy cavalry was not to meet it head-on. It was to envelope it. Feigned retreats designed to draw cavalry pursuit out of formation, then envelopment and archery destruction of the isolated pursuers, encirclement of marching columns to deny water and forage, constant harassment designed to exhaust men and horses before a decisive engagement. This was a doctrine of strategic patience applied with tactical aggression, and against an undisciplined European cavalry force that had not yet learned to restrain its charge reflex, it was devastatingly effective. The Crusaders' adaptation to this tactical reality was the most significant military, intellectual achievement of the First Crusade. The march formation they developed, sometimes called the marching square or the integrated column, was an operational solution of genuine sophistication. The cavalry was positioned inside a perimeter of infantry, sheltered from archery by the density of the foot soldiers' formation. Crossbowmen were positioned on the vulnerable flanks and rear. The column moved as a single organism, absorbing harassment fire but denying the Seljuks the decisive engagement they needed to inflict a genuine defeat. The discipline required to maintain this formation, to hold knights inside the infantry screen while Turkish arrows fell around them, while taunting enemy cavalry rode within what seemed striking distance, was the central command challenge of the entire Anatolian march. It was a challenge that was sometimes met brilliantly and sometimes failed catastrophically, with consequences measured in blood. The siege equipment of the First Crusade was, by the standards of contemporary Byzantine or Islamic military engineering, relatively primitive. The Crusaders had no established corps of military engineers equivalent to the Byzantine mechanikoi or the sophisticated siege train that Islamic armies could field. What they possessed was an improvisational capability, the ability to construct functional, if crude, siege machinery from locally available timber and whatever engineering knowledge existed within their diverse contingent. The trebuchet, the counterweight siege engine that would become the dominant siege weapon of the medieval period, was either not yet in widespread use in 1096 or was present only in early, less efficient traction variants. The Crusaders relied primarily on wooden siege towers, battering rams, covered approach tunnels called saps, and scaling ladders. They supplemented these with mangonels, torsion-powered catapults, capable of hurling stones of 50 to 100 pounds at fortification walls. Effective siegecraft required two resources the Crusaders consistently struggled to maintain: timber and time. Timber for siege construction was often scarce in the semi-arid Near Eastern landscape, requiring expeditions of significant distance and logistical complexity to procure. Time was the more critical scarcity. A besieging force that could not seal a city from external relief faced the prospect of being caught between the garrison and an approaching relief army, the military nightmare of the siege from both sides that the Crusaders would experience with varying degrees of agony at Antioch, Acre, and Jerusalem itself. The logistical system, or rather its consistent near absence, was the Crusade's most chronic vulnerability. The 11th century crusading force had no equivalent of a modern military's quartermaster corps. Resupply depended on a shifting combination of Byzantine maritime support, local purchase or requisition, agricultural plunder, and the precarious goodwill of Armenian Christian communities in Anatolia and northern Syria who provided intelligence, local knowledge, and occasional supply. The Genoese and Venetian maritime contribution deserves specific acknowledgement. At Jaffa, the arrival of Genoese ships carrying skilled craftsmen, disassembled siege equipment components, iron fittings, and crucially needed timber provided the material foundation for the successful siege of Jerusalem in 1099. The commercial maritime republics of northern Italy, motivated by the trading, concessions, and commercial privileges they correctly anticipated would follow a successful crusade, provided a logistical force multiplier without which Jerusalem might never have fallen. The order of battle for the First Crusade was, therefore, a system of remarkable complexity operating under conditions of extreme resource constraint. Its strengths were real and significant: the offensive shock power of the armored cavalry, the defensive resilience of the infantry square when properly maintained, the adaptive intelligence of commanders who learned from defeat, and the religious conviction that sustained the force through conditions that would have dissolved a purely mercenary force long before Jerusalem came into sight. Its weaknesses were equally real: the persistent tension between individual glory-seeking and collective tactical discipline, the inadequate logistical foundation, the disease that bled the force continuously, and the political dysfunction of a multi-commander structure without genuine unity of effort. That this system, with all its fractures and contradictions, delivered the Crusaders to the walls of Jerusalem in June 1099 is a testament to the combined weight of military adaptability, Islamic political fragmentation, and the genuinely extraordinary quality of individual command decisions made by men operating at the absolute outer edge of their resources. The hammer was imperfect, the cross was heavy, but together they moved. The march from Constantinople to Jerusalem covered approximately 2,500 kilometers. The Crusaders covered it in approximately 2 years. That arithmetic conceals an ordeal of such sustained physical and psychological intensity that it defies comfortable description. Disease, starvation, thirst, battle, massacre, internal mutiny, and theological crisis all visited the crusading force in sequence and simultaneously. What emerged from that ordeal at the walls of Jerusalem in June 1099 was not the same force that had assembled on the Bosphorus in the spring of 1097. It was a smaller, harder, more desperate, and more dangerous instrument. Let us follow the campaign through its critical phases. The Crusaders' first significant military objective was Nicaea, the former Byzantine capital and now the seat of the Seljuk. Sultanate of Rum under Kilij Arslan I. Nicaea's fortifications were formidable, massive walls of late Roman construction, a garrison of determined defenders, and the protection of Lake Ascania on its western flank, which allowed resupply and potential reinforcement by water. Kilij Arslan made a critical command error of assessment. He had dismissed the Crusaders, informed by the destruction of Peter the Hermit's people's crusade, as an undifferentiated mass of religious fanatics rather than a genuine military force. He was campaigning against a rival Turkish ruler in eastern Anatolia when the crusading army arrived before Nicaea. He corrected his assessment and returned rapidly, launching a relief attack against the crusading force besieging the city on May 21, 1097. The Crusaders, organized into defensive positions that provided overlapping fields of missile fire, repelled the attack with significant Seljuk casualties. The ferocity and discipline of the crusading response shocked Kilij Arslan, who withdrew to reassess. Nicaea fell not by direct assault but through Byzantine diplomatic back-channel negotiation. Alexios arranged a surrender to Byzantine forces that infuriated the Crusaders, who had expected to sack the city and recoup their supply costs through plunder. The first great friction point between Crusader and Byzantine interests had manifested, and it would only deepen. The Battle of Dorylaeum is the First Crusade's most analytically instructive engagement, precisely because it reveals both the devastating effectiveness of Seljuk tactics and the extraordinary recovery capacity of the crusading force when command communication functioned. Kilij Arslan had learned from Nicaea. He assembled a substantial force and prepared to strike the crusading column while it was divided during its march through the Anatolian plateau. The crusading force had separated into two columns for logistical reasons. Bohemond of Taranto commanded the advance guard with the Norman contingent and allied forces. Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and the papal legate Adhemar of Le Puy commanded the main body, a half-day's march behind. Kilij Arslan struck Bohemond's column at dawn on July 1st with the full weight of his cavalry. The Seljuk attack was a textbook application of their envelopment doctrine. Horse archers circled the crusading formation, maintaining a distance that kept them beyond lance range while delivering continuous archery into the packed mass of men and animals. The intensity of the fire was described by crusading chroniclers as so dense that the sky darkened. Horses screamed and fell. Knights were driven from their mounts by arrow wounds to unprotected areas. The momentum of the attack was continuously maintained by fresh waves of riders. Bohemond's response was the moment that revealed his genuine military quality. He did not charge. In the face of every cultural and psychological pressure to lead his knights in a furious counterassault, Bohemond held his force in defensive formation. He dismounted knights where necessary to reinforce the infantry line. He positioned his non-combatants in the center where they were protected and where their presence motivated the soldiers surrounding them. He sent urgent messengers to the main body, and he held. For hours, against everything Kilij Arslan threw at him, Bohemond held. The arrival of the main crusading body, led by Godfrey and Raymond, having pushed their forces to the limit of endurance to reach the battle, converted a near catastrophe into a decisive crusader victory. The sudden appearance of fresh cavalry on the Seljuk flanks disrupted the envelopment. Kilij Arslan's force, which had been executing a sophisticated tactical design, encountered a situation its doctrine had not anticipated and broke. The Seljuks abandoned their camp, and with it, their treasury, their supplies, and their strategic initiative in Anatolia. Dorylaeum did not end Seljuk resistance, but it broke Kilij Arslan's ability to mount a coordinated strategic defense. The road through Anatolia lay, if not open, at least passable. The march across the Anatolian plateau from Dorylaeum to the Cilician Gates remains one of the most punishing operational movements in recorded military history. The Seljuks, having failed to stop the Crusaders in open battle, turned to the strategy of exhaustion. They stripped the land ahead of the crusading column, burning forage, poisoning or destroying wells, driving livestock beyond reach. What they created was a moving desert in front of an army already operating beyond its supply capacity. The climate delivered its own assault. The Anatolian summer of 1097 was brutal. Temperatures on the exposed plateau exceeded what European bodies, acclimated to northern climates, could comfortably manage. Men died of heat stroke in their armor. Horses, deprived of adequate water and forage, began dying in significant numbers. The crusading force that had fielded perhaps 7,000 cavalry horses at Constantinople was reduced to perhaps 2,000 serviceable mounts by the time it reached northern Syria. Knights who had invested their entire fortune in their destriers were reduced to using oxen and draft animals as improvised riding horses, a humiliation that the chronicles record with the mixture of pathos and dark comedy that characterizes authentic accounts of military suffering. Disease was constant. The specific pathogens are impossible to identify with certainty from medieval accounts, but typhoid, dysentery, and scurvy were almost certainly present. The combination of contaminated water, inadequate nutrition, physical exhaustion, and the accumulated stress of sustained combat exposure created a force that was significantly diminished in both numbers and physical capacity by the time it arrived at Antioch in October 1097. The siege of Antioch was the defining operational experience of the First Crusade, a 9-month ordeal that tested the crusading, forced to the absolute limit of its endurance and revealed every fracture line in its command structure. Antioch was the third city of the Byzantine Empire, and its fortifications were proportionally magnificent. The walls stretched for approximately 30 kilometers, following the mountainous terrain in a design that made complete investment by the crusading force, which lacked the numbers to man a full circumvallation, essentially impossible. The garrison, commanded by the capable Yagician, could receive resupply from the mountains while the besieging army slowly starved in the lowlands. And starve they did. The winter of 1097 to 1098 at Antioch was the Crusade's darkest period. Supply convoys from the coast were intercepted. local foraging was exhausted. The chronicles describe scenes of genuine famine, men boiling leather, eating their horses, competing for scraps. Desertion increased, including, infamously, the flight of Stephen of Blois, who departed for Constantinople and reported to Alexios that the crusade was finished. Through this winter, Bohemond's strategic calculation was already forming. He had identified, through intelligence contacts within the city, a disaffected Armenian guard captain named Firuz who controlled a section of the wall. Bohemond began negotiating covertly while managing his own men's survival. In June 1098, just as a massive Seljuk relief force under Kerboga of Mosul approached to relieve the garrison, Bohemond moved. Firuz opened the tower. Crusading forces poured into the city in the darkness before dawn, and Antioch fell to an assault that was part military operation and part conspiracy of desperation. Within 3 days, the situation inverted with almost cinematic brutality. Kerboga's relief force arrived and besieged the now Crusader-held city. The besiegers had become the besieged, trapped inside a city with a still resistant citadel above them and a massive enemy force outside the walls. It was at this moment that the Holy Lance was discovered. The monk Peter Bartholomew claimed a vision of St. Andrew directing him to excavate beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter, where the lance that had pierced Christ's side would be found. After excavation and conveniently timely discovery, the relic was produced. Whether manufactured or genuinely unearthed, its effect on the crusading force's morale was the equivalent of a combat stimulant administered to a force on the verge of collapse. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch to meet Kerboga in open battle. The tactical logic was almost insane. A starving, disease-depleted force voluntarily engaging a numerically superior enemy outside the city walls rather than enduring a siege they might survive. But the calculus of starvation had already made the choice. Slow death inside was equivalent to risk of death outside, with at least the possibility of decisive victory. Kerboga's force, riven by internal political tensions among his allied commanders, failed to concentrate when the crusading column emerged. Units hesitated, waiting for each other, creating gaps in what should have been an overwhelming envelopment. The Crusaders, their morale electrified by the Holy Lance and the Sermon of Adhemar, pressed forward with the controlled aggression of men who had resolved to die fighting rather than starve. Kerboga's coalition broke before a general engagement could be properly joined. The political fragmentation that had been the Crusades' persistent strategic advantage manifested again at the decisive moment. The siege of Antioch was lifted. Bohemond claimed the city for himself. The oaths sworn to Alexios were discarded. The Principality of Antioch was born. The force that arrived before Jerusalem on June 7, 1099, was a shadow of the army that had left Constantinople. Perhaps 12,000 to 15,000 remained, of whom perhaps 1,200 to 1,300 were mounted cavalry. The Fatimid garrison under Iftikhar ad-Dawla was smaller, but was defending the most formidable fortification. In the Near East, walls that had resisted assault for centuries. The first assault on June 13th failed. The Crusaders lacked adequate siege equipment and the psychological coordination required for a successful escalade. The turning point was logistical. Genoese ships arrived at Jaffa carrying not reinforcements in numbers but something more valuable, skilled craftsmen and, critically, the raw materials and hardware for constructing proper siege machinery. Timber was procured, with great difficulty, from the forest to the north. 3 massive siege towers were constructed, one commanded by Raymond at the southwest, 2 commanded by Godfrey and Tancred at the north wall. On the night of July 13th, Godfrey's tower was moved against the north wall. On the morning of July 15th, 1099, after fierce combat in which the Tower S-Bridge was lowered onto the wall and crusading knights poured onto the battlements, the north wall was breached, the city fell. What followed in the streets of Jerusalem was a massacre of such concentrated violence that it has defined the historical memory of the Crusades ever since. The Muslim and Jewish populations were killed with a thoroughness that shocked even some contemporary observers. The Temple Mount ran with blood. The Crusaders had reached Jerusalem. The First Crusade had achieved its stated objective. The cost was measured in tens of thousands of lives, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and in the inauguration of an antagonism between the Islamic world and Western Christendom, whose reverberations have not fully ceased. Victory at Jerusalem in 1099 solved one problem and created another of equal difficulty. The Crusaders had taken the city, now they had to hold it. The Crusader states, Outremer, the land beyond the sea, as contemporaries called them, represent one of history's most extraordinary experiments in colonial military governance. For nearly 2 centuries, a relatively small European population attempted to maintain political and military control over a territory surrounded on all sides by Muslim powers of vastly greater demographic and economic depth. Understanding how they sustained this effort and why it ultimately failed is an exercise in the analysis of strategic overextension set against the backdrop of extraordinary tactical ingenuity. The political architecture of Outremer was established with surprising speed. Godfrey of Bouillon was offered the crown of Jerusalem and declined it, reportedly stating that he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. He accepted instead the title of Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, a distinction that was functionally equivalent to kingship without its theological awkwardness. When Godfrey died the following year, his brother Baldwin of Edessa assumed the throne without similar scruples and accepted the title of King of Jerusalem. By 1109, 4 Crusader states had been established. The Kingdom of Jerusalem as the dominant political entity, the county of Edessa in the north as the most vulnerable and easternmost buffer, the Principality of Antioch under Bohemond's successors on the Syrian coast, and the county of Tripoli under Raymond's heirs bridging the gap between them. These were feudal states in the European tradition, transplanted into an environment for which that tradition was imperfectly adapted. The fundamental strategic vulnerability of Outremer was demographic. The Frankish, a generic term applied to all Western European settlers, population never exceeded perhaps 250,000 people in the most optimistic estimates, ruling over a subject population of Muslim, Eastern Christian, and Jewish inhabitants numbering in the millions. The military force that could be raised from this Frankish population was always insufficient for the strategic perimeter that the Crusader states needed to defend. This structural inadequacy produced the most distinctive military institutions of the crusading era. The military orders were the Crusades' most original contribution to the art of war. The Knights Hospitaller, established to provide medical care for pilgrims and gradually militarized into a fighting order, and the Knights Templar, founded specifically as a military religious order to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. These institutions represented a synthesis of monastic discipline and military professionalism that had no precedent in European history. The Templar rule, codified under Bernard of Clairvaux's influence in 1129, established a military community governed by religious vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. This last vow was the operationally significant innovation. Templar knights fought under command authority far more unified and absolute than anything the feudal nobility of Outremer could produce. They could not charge without permission. They could not retreat without order. They could not negotiate ransom or surrender without command authorization. This was, in military terms, a revolution in medieval operational culture. The military orders became the permanent garrison force of Outremer, the professional military corps around which the kingdom's defense was organized. Their network of fortifications, the Krak des Chevaliers, Beaver Safed, and dozens of smaller but formidable castles represented a defensive system of extraordinary sophistication designed to provide mutual support, control key road intersections, and maintain a defensive perimeter around the kingdom's agricultural heartland. Krak des Chevaliers, garrisoned by the Hospitallers, was perhaps the most militarily sophisticated fortification in the medieval world. Its concentric design and outer wall, creating a killing ground around an inner citadel, meant that even if attackers breached the outer wall, they faced the task of reducing a second, more formidable fortification while under fire from the elevated inner defenses. Its water cisterns, designed to store a full year's supply, made starvation siege essentially impractical against a defended garrison. Its design incorporated glacis slopes, inclined stone surfaces that deflected siege projectiles and made mining operations enormously difficult. The military orders paid for these fortifications through their European network of commanderies, agricultural estates, and commercial operations across France, England, Spain, and Germany that generated the revenue flowing into Outremer's military infrastructure. They were, in modern terms, a self-funding defense contractor with religious motivations. The military doctrine of Outremer evolved under the continuous pressure of fighting an enemy who had adapted completely to the tactical realities of the Near Eastern theater. The successors of the Seljuks, the Zengi dynasty under Imad ad-Din Zengi and his son Nur ad-Din, and ultimately the Ayyubid dynasty under Saladin, were sophisticated military thinkers who studied the Crusaders' strengths and constructed their own doctrine around avoiding them. The marching square formation, the integrated column that had carried the First Crusade through Anatolia, became the standard operational doctrine of Crusader armies in the field. Its discipline requirements were codified and its tactical logic refined over decades of operational experience. The key principle was the preservation of the cavalry until the decisive moment, hold the formation, absorb the harassment, wait for the enemy to commit to a position that justified the devastating expenditure of a coordinated cavalry charge. When this doctrine was properly executed, as at the Battle of Arsuf in 1191, where Richard the First of England held his charging knights on an iron rein against intense Ayyubid harassment for hours before releasing them in a coordinated assault, it produced results of almost clinical efficiency. When it failed, as at the catastrophic Battle of the Field of Blood in 1119, where Roger of Antioch allowed himself to be surrounded and destroyed, the results were the tactical mirror image. The Field of Blood represents the template for Crusader catastrophe. Roger of Antioch, facing the invasion of Ilghazi of Mardin, chose to advance to meet the threat rather than await reinforcement. He marched his force into broken terrain where the envelopment capability of Turkish cavalry, the persistent, fundamental threat to Crusader armies in the field, was maximized. He denied himself the defensive depth of the integrated formation by advancing aggressively on terrain that prevented its maintenance. Ilghazi enveloped him completely. The Antiochian army was destroyed as a coherent force. Roger himself was killed. The Principality of Antioch barely survived the subsequent invasion. The lesson was not new. It had been available since Dorylaeum, but the structural tension between the aggressive, offensive culture of the feudal knight and the disciplined, defensive requirements of sound Outremer military doctrine was never fully resolved. Every generation produced its Roger of Antioch, willing to gamble the kingdom on a single forward movement. The county of Edessa fell to Zengi in 1144, the first significant contraction of Crusader territorial control. Its fall demonstrated the structural weakness of Outremer's defensive system. The four Crusader states, nominally unified under the Kingdom of Jerusalem, functioned in practice as independent political entities whose cooperation was intermittent and whose rivalries were occasionally more operationally damaging than enemy pressure. Edessa fell because no reinforcement arrived in time. The political calculus of the other Crusader lords, preoccupied with their own borders, their own dynastic concerns, their own relationships with local Muslim allies, prevented the concentrated response that Edessa's survival required. The fall of Edessa triggered the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade, commanded by Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, the most exalted monarchs of Western Europe, was perhaps the most operationally incompetent major military enterprise of the medieval period. The decision by the crusading leadership against the advice of the experienced military minds of Outremer to attack Damascus, the one Muslim power in the region with which the Kingdom of Jerusalem maintained a working relationship, was a strategic error of almost incomprehensible scale. It converted a potential ally into a determined enemy and demonstrated the fundamental problem of externally commanded crusading expeditions. Forces arriving from Europe with their own agendas, their own glory-seeking, and their limited operational understanding of the theater were frequently more damaging to Outremer's strategic position than the enemies they had come to fight. The Second Crusade accomplished nothing. It left Outremer weaker than it had found it. The decades that followed Edessa's fall were a slow tightening of the strategic vice. Nur ad-Din, Zengi's far more capable son, pursued a policy of deliberate strategic encirclement, absorbing Damascus through political pressure, suppressing the political fragmentation that had been Outremer's persistent advantage, and constructing for the first time a unified Syrian-Egyptian Muslim strategic direction against the Crusader states. When Nur ad-Din's Kurdish general, Saladin, completed the conquest of Fatimid Egypt in 1171 and subsequently inherited Syria upon Nur ad-Din's death in 1174, the strategic encirclement of Outremer was complete. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was now surrounded on all sides by a single, unified political and military authority of vastly greater resources. The countdown to 1187 had begun. July 4th, 1187, the plateau above the Sea of Galilee. A dry, volcanic landscape of black basalt and parched grass under a hammer-blow summer sun. On this ground, Saladin did not merely win a battle. He dismantled a kingdom. The Battle of Hattin is the Crusade's most analytically complete engagement, a case study in the application of strategic intelligence, operational patience, and tactical precision that remains instructive 9 centuries after it was fought. To understand Hattin is to understand both the genius of Saladin and the structural failure of everything Outremer had built since 1099. The strategic situation of 1187 had been carefully constructed over years. Saladin had spent the decade since 1177, probing, testing, and mapping the Crusader defense system with the methodical intelligence of a commander who understood that he needed to understand his enemy's responses before he could predict and defeat them. He had won battles and lost battles, notably the defeat at Montgisard in 1177, where the young leper king, Baldwin IV, had executed a textbook cavalry charge with devastating effect. But each engagement had refined his operational understanding. He had identified the Kingdom of Jerusalem's central strategic vulnerability, the tension between the need to maintain the integrated defensive doctrine and the political pressure to respond to raids and threats with offensive action. The kingdom's military establishment in 1187 was led by a man whose appointment had been driven by political intrigue rather than military competence. King Guy of Lusignan was a French noble of undistinguished military record who had obtained the throne through marriage to Baldwin IV's sister Sibylla. He was surrounded by a court divided between the aggressive council of Reynold of Chatillon, whose deliberate violations of truces with Saladin had provided the casus belli for the 1187 campaign, and the cautious advice of Raymond III of Tripoli, the kingdom's most experienced military mind. Saladin understood this division and exploited it with surgical precision. In late June 1187, Saladin crossed the Jordan with a force that contemporary accounts estimate at 20,000 cavalry, perhaps somewhat fewer, in the most formidable army he had yet assembled. He attacked Tiberias on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, besieging the citadel where Raymond of Tripoli's wife Esquiva commanded the garrison. Then he waited. The attack on Tiberias was a calculated provocation, a deliberate invitation to the Kingdom of Jerusalem to mobilize and advance. Saladin had positioned his army on the plateau east of Tiberias, controlling the water sources. The terrain between the Crusader assembly point at Saphiria and Tiberias was dry, broken, and easily dominated by mobile cavalry. To advance to Tiberias was to march into a killing ground of Saladin's design. Raymond of Tripoli, whose own wife was besieged in Tiberias, counseled explicitly against advancing. He argued, with the operational clarity of a man who understood the theater, that the army should remain at Saphiria where water was abundant, wait for Saladin's force to fracture under the logistical pressure of maintaining its concentration, and deal with the loss of Tiberias as a tactical setback rather than risk the destruction of the kingdom's entire military force. It was sound advice. It was rejected. Reynold of Chatillon and the Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard of Rydfort, both men whose psychological investment in aggressive action overrode their tactical judgment, argued for advance. The humiliation of remaining passive while a Muslim army besieged a Christian city, with a Christian noblewoman defending its citadel, was insupportable. Guy of Lusignan, constitutionally unable to hold a position under pressure, authorized the advance. On July 3rd, the Crusader army marched from Saphiria toward Tiberias. The march of July 3rd was Saladin's operation even before a blade was drawn. The Crusader column, approximately 1,200 cavalry and perhaps 15,000 to 18,000 infantry, moved into the exact terrain configuration Saladin had selected, under the exact climatic conditions he had anticipated. The summer heat on the basalt plateau was extraordinary. Turkish cavalry harassed the column's flanks and rear continuously, preventing foraging and denying any opportunity to rest. The pace of advance slowed as men and horses began to suffer from thirst. The column failed to reach the springs at Hattin by nightfall. Encamped on a dry plateau without water, with Turkish cavalry maintaining pressure around the perimeter, the Crusader force spent a night of mounting desperation. Saladin ordered fires lit in the dry grass upwind of the Crusader camp, the smoke adding respiratory distress to thirst and exhaustion. The psychological pressure was as precisely calibrated as the tactical. On the morning of July 4th, the Crusader leadership faced an impossible tactical dilemma that Saladin had spent months engineering. They could not advance to water without breaking formation under sustained cavalry harassment. They could not retreat without abandoning the tactical cohesion that was their only defense. They could not remain in position without dying of thirst. Raymond of Tripoli led a cavalry charge to the north, whether to create a breakout route or in simple desperation, the accounts differ. Saladin's forces parted to let him through, a deliberate tactical choice that removed the kingdom's best military mind from the subsequent engagement, and then closed again behind him. Raymond escaped, the kingdom did not. The infantry began to disintegrate. Without the protective envelope of a disciplined foot formation, the cavalry lost its defensive structure. Individual groups of Templar and Hospitaller knights made desperate charges that were absorbed and destroyed by the surrounding Turkish cavalry. Guy of Lusignan attempted to rally his forces around a red tent on the twin volcanic hills known as the Horns of Hattin, a final defensive position that provided elevation but no water and no exit. By midday, the battle was over. The True Cross, the kingdom's most sacred relic, carried into every major engagement as a spiritual force multiplier, was captured. Guy of Lusignan was taken prisoner. Reynold of Chatillon was personally executed by Saladin. The military order's surviving knights, Templars, and Hospitallers were segregated and beheaded in mass executions ordered by Saladin, who understood that their return to captivity and subsequent ransom would restore exactly the military core he needed to permanently eliminate. The Kingdom of Jerusalem's field army had ceased to exist. Jerusalem fell on October 2, 1187. Saladin's conduct of the siege and the subsequent surrender negotiations stands in deliberate and evident contrast to the massacre of 1099. He negotiated a ransom for the city's population, accepted payment that was only partially fulfilled, and released many who could not pay rather than executing them as military doctrine might have permitted. This was not merely personal magnanimity. It was strategic communication, a deliberate statement to the Islamic world and to history that the reconquest of Jerusalem was not a mirror image of its original conquest, but something morally and politically superior. The response in Europe was instantaneous and convulsive. Pope Gregory VIII issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi within days of receiving the news. The Third Crusade was being assembled before Jerusalem's ransom payments had been completed. The Third Crusade, the most militarily competent of all the crusading enterprises, was commanded by three monarchs: Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England. Frederick drowned crossing a river in Anatolia, his death dissolving the German contingent almost immediately. Philip arrived in the Holy Land, participated in the siege of Acre, quarreled with Richard, and returned to France to manage the political opportunities his rival's absence created. Richard remained. Richard I, Coeur de Lion, is the Third Crusade's analytical centerpiece. His military competence was not the romantic heroism of legend, but something considerably more interesting: a professional intelligence applied to the specific operational problems of the Near Eastern theater, with a rigor that his predecessors had rarely matched. His march from Acre to Jaffa in August-September 1191 was the most perfect execution of the integrated column doctrine the Crusades ever produced. His force maintained formation against continuous Ayyubid harassment with iron discipline, The infantry outer screen absorbing fire, the cavalry preserved within. Archers managing the flanks for weeks of march under conditions of extreme climatic and physical stress. At Arsuf on September 7/1191, when the Hospitaller rear finally broke discipline and charged, Richard converted the unauthorized action into a coordinated assault with the reflexive tactical intelligence of a commander who could read and respond to a battle in real time. The Ayyubid force at Arsuf was decisively repelled, but Arsuf was not Hattin in reverse. Richard reached the outskirts of Jerusalem twice and withdrew both times, the first commander in the Crusading era to subjugate the emotional pull of Jerusalem's symbolic weight to a cold operational assessment. His reasoning was sound. Jerusalem could be taken. The logistics did not exist to hold it against the Saladin counter-siege in the summer, with the European contingents beginning to prepare for departure home. A taken and immediately lost Jerusalem was worse, politically and strategically, than a Jerusalem not taken. The Treaty of Jaffa in 1192, a 3-year truce that secured Christian pilgrimage access to Jerusalem without recovering political control, was Richard's answer. It was rational. It was operationally defensible. It was also, to many of his contemporaries, a crushing disappointment. Richard sailed home. Saladin died the following year, in 1193. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The Crusades did not end with a single decisive moment. They ended, as all extended strategic enterprises end, with a slow, grinding recognition that the foundational assumptions on which the enterprise had been built had been invalidated by events, by demography, by political change, and by the accumulated weight of 2 centuries of attrition. The fall of Acre on May 18, 1291 was not a surprise. It was a conclusion. The Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Halalas assault on the last major Crusader city in the Holy Land was the methodical completion of a strategic project that had been unfolding since Hattin. The Mamluks, a military dynasty of slave soldiers, whose professional lethality made the Ayyubids look moderate, had been systematically reducing the remaining Crusader coastal fortresses for decades. Acre, with its double walls and access to maritime resupply, was the last significant obstacle. It fell to an assault of overwhelming force, engineering sophistication, and the simple arithmetic of superior numbers applied against a garrison that could no longer realistically expect reinforcement. The Crusader states had lasted nearly 2 centuries. Their fall was not an accident or a sudden catastrophe. It was the terminal phase of a structural impossibility, a small colonial military establishment attempting to hold a vast strategic perimeter against powers with incomparably greater demographic, economic, and geographic depth. The human cost of the Crusading era resists precise quantification but demands acknowledgement. The First Crusade alone killed perhaps 100,000 to 300,000 people in its combined military operations. The massacre at Jerusalem and the various sieges and battles of the campaign, the People's Crusade, the Rhineland massacres of Jewish communities, and the incidental violence of passage through Byzantine and Anatolian territory add further to a toll that accumulated for 2 centuries. The total death toll of the Crusading era, combining all 9 numbered Crusades plus the Northern Crusades, the Albigensian Crusade, and the incidental violence of Crusader settlement, is measured in the millions. Modern historians' estimates range widely, from 1 to 3 million, with the uncertainty reflecting both the inadequacy of medieval demographic records and the genuine difficulty of distinguishing Crusade-specific violence from the endemic violence of the medieval period. The Jewish communities of the Rhineland destroyed in the pogroms of 1096 represent the Crusade's most directly attributable atrocity against a non-combatant population within Europe itself. These massacres, carried out largely by the undisciplined contingents of the People's Crusade, established a pattern of violent, Christian anti-Semitism that the institutional church condemned in principle and failed to prevent in practice. The population of Jerusalem itself, massacred in 1099 and again subjected to periodic violence in the subsequent decades, suffered a demographic disruption whose scale is difficult to assess, but whose human reality requires no numerical precision. The military art of the Crusading era produced innovations of lasting significance. The development of the concentric castle, the defensive architectural form pioneered in Outremer and subsequently adopted throughout Europe, represents the era's most direct and measurable contribution to military technology. The insight that a wall protecting a wall created an interior killing ground that could defeat even a successful outer wall breach fundamentally altered the calculus of medieval siege warfare. Krak des Chevaliers was the operational laboratory. The castles of Edward I in Wales and the fortifications of the later medieval period across Europe were its intellectual offspring. The military orders established an institutional template for the professionalized military that transcended the feudal levy system. The concept of a permanent, trained, professionally led military force sustained by dedicated economic infrastructure rather than the seasonal, motivation-dependent feudal host pointed toward the standing armies of the early modern period. The logistical lessons of the Crusades, learned in blood over 2 centuries of operational experience, contributed to an evolving understanding of the relationship between supply, strategic mobility, and military effectiveness. The crusading experience demonstrated with brutal, repeated emphasis that no military force could sustain extended operations beyond its logistical foundation regardless of its tactical quality. This lesson, obvious in retrospect, was sufficiently counterintuitive to medieval commanders that it required 200 years of repeated demonstration to achieve even partial operational acceptance. The encounter between Western crusading military doctrine and the Islamic military traditions of the Seljuks, Zengids, Ayyubids, and Mamluks produced a mutual education of far-reaching consequence. Western military thinking absorbed, imperfectly but genuinely, elements of the mobile cavalry tactics, the more sophisticated siege engineering, and the strategic patience that characterized the best Islamic commanders. The mathematical and scientific knowledge of the Islamic world, including advances in military engineering and ballistics, entered European intellectual circulation partly through the crusading encounter. Islamic military development, in turn, was shaped by the sustained confrontation with the Crusader, castle-building tradition, and the tactical innovations of the integrated column. Saladin's careful study of Crusader strengths and his precise targeting of the conditions that rendered those strengths ineffective produced a methodology of strategic analysis that influenced subsequent Islamic military thinking. The Mamluks, who would eventually absorb both Ayyubid Syria and defeat the Mongol invasion at Ain Jalut in 1260, represented the synthesis of these influences, a military system that combined the mobile cavalry tradition of the steppe with the disciplined professionalism of a standing force and the defensive sophistication of a castle-building culture. The geopolitical legacy of the Crusades is a subject of persistent and frequently anachronistic debate. The temptation to draw direct lines from the events of 1099 to the political dynamics of the contemporary Middle East is analytically understandable and historically treacherous. The specific political structures, religious identities, and territorial configurations of the modern region bear complex, mediated relationships to the crusading period that resist simple genealogy. What can be stated with analytical confidence is that the crusading era contributed to a long-term deterioration in the relationship between Western Christianity and Islam, and particularly between European Christians and Jewish communities that would have consequences extending well beyond the medieval period. Have you ever wondered what the Crusades were really about? It's a story often painted in simple strokes of black and white, but the reality is far more complex and fascinating. Let's dive into one of history's most debated chapters. It all started in 1095 when Pope Urban II called for a holy war. The official goal? To reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim rule. Thousands answered the call, driven by faith, a promise of salvation, and for some, the chance for land and wealth. This was the First Crusade, and surprisingly, it was a military success for the Crusaders, who captured Jerusalem in 1099. But this was just the beginning. Over the next 2 centuries, a series of crusades followed, and they weren't all fought in the Middle East. Some were directed against pagans in Europe or political enemies of the Pope. The motivations evolved too. While religion remained a powerful force, economic factors became increasingly important. Cities like Venice and Genoa saw the Crusades as a massive business opportunity, funding expeditions in exchange for trade routes and riches. So, were they a success or a failure? Militarily, after the first one, the results were mixed at best. The Crusaders struggled to hold on to their territories, and subsequent campaigns, like the infamous Fourth Crusade, which sacked the Christian city of Constantinople, were disastrous. The long-term consequences are immense. The Crusades fueled centuries of mistrust between the Christian and Islamic worlds. They reshaped the map of Europe and the Middle East, accelerated trade, and exposed Europeans to new ideas, art, and science from the East, which arguably helped spark the Renaissance. The story of the Crusades is not just about knights and battles. It's a powerful lesson in how religion, politics, and economics can collide, shaping our world in ways we still feel today. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. See you next time. The Western crusading tradition believed that faith could substitute for or amplify beyond recognition the material requirements of military success. That God's will, expressed through the crusading enterprise, would compensate for inadequate logistics, fractured command, and insufficient numbers. Sometimes at Jerusalem in 1099, at Antioch in 1098, at Arsif in 1191, the combination of faith and military competence produced results that seemed to validate this belief. More often, the ledger recorded the opposite. The Field of Blood, the Second Crusade, Hattin, the Children's Crusade. The disasters of the 6th and 7th Crusades in Egypt. The slow erosion of Outremer against the simple arithmetic of demographic and economic reality. The Islamic commanders who ultimately prevailed, Zengi, Nur ad-Din, Saladin, Baybars, Halil, were not irreligious men. They too fought beneath the banner of faith. But their military cultures maintained a respect for the material requirements of warfare, for logistics, for demographic depth, for unified command, for the patient strategic vision that the feudal crusading enterprise so consistently struggled to sustain that proved over the long calculus of 2 centuries decisive. The canvas of the Crusades is vast, violent, and irreducibly complex. It is painted in the deepest colors available to history: sacred conviction and political ambition, extraordinary courage and systematic atrocity, military genius and catastrophic incompetence. It remains, 9 centuries later, one of the most consequential and cautionary masterworks in the entire gallery of human conflict. The design was impossible. The execution was magnificent and terrible. And the reckoning in blood, in consequence, in the long memory of civilizations, has never fully concluded. You have just walked the full arc of the crusading era, from the field at Clermont to the smoking ruins of Acre, from the logistical improvisation of the First Crusade's Aes Anatolian crossing to Saladin's geometrically precise entrapment at Hattin. From the architectural genius of Krak Chevaliers to the cold strategic brilliance of Richard the First's march to Jaffa. This is what War Atelier exists to do. Not to tell you what happened, anyone can do that. To show you how it was engineered, the doctrine, the decision, the precise moment where the plan met the friction of reality and either held or shattered. If that perspective changes how you see history, if you now look at a medieval fortification and see a logistical argument, or look at a cavalry charge and see a command authority problem, then the work here is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Subscribe to War Atelier. Every analysis on this channel is built to the same standard, rigorous, precise, and built for an audience that demands more than the surface of history. Turn on notifications. The next analysis is already in production, and it operates at the same depth as what you just watched. If this episode gave you something, a new framework, a sharper question, a deeper understanding of how organized violence has shaped the world, share it. The audience that appreciates this kind of work needs to find it. The canvas of history is vast. War Atelier is how we learn to read it.